I'm Brian Yothers, Chair of the Department of English at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I'm going to be talking today about anti-slavery literature and the Constitution. Now, this might seem to be a little bit of a different context than you would expect for an English class, right? You think of your English classes, you're often studying fiction, you're studying poetry, you're studying how to write a strong essay, but sometimes when we talk about fiction and poetry, we're talking about materials that have implications relative to the law and relative to our understanding of the Constitution. We also study non-fictional texts that go beyond fiction, poetry, and drama. And here we have a chance to see how a body of literature that grew up in the 19th century in reaction to the injustices of slavery actually interacts with how we understand the Constitution, how constitutional interpretation shaped the literature of the early 19th century in the United States. I'm going to share some slides with you and we'll talk our way through how this works. And I think this is a nice example of how richly a major like English interconnects with the kind of work that you do if you're preparing for law school or if you're thinking about just being more involved as a citizen in this country. Okay, so I am sharing my screen now. And you'll see that what we've got here is a discussion of anti-slavery literature and the Constitution. And to start out, it's important to realize the role that slavery played and the controversies over slavery played in the 19th century United States. You'll notice that here I'm referring to it as antebellum, which simply means before the war. The war in question being the Civil War, and really the great moral, political, and economic issue of the decades between the ratification of the United States Constitution and its implementation in 1789 and the end of the Civil War in 1865 was slavery. The question that had to be resolved was, does one human being have the right to hold another as property? That question was the great moral question of the first half of the 19th century, and the Constitution was at the center of these controversies. Both those who opposed slavery and those who supported it claimed the Constitution as supporting their side. And it's important to realize this, that the Constitution was contested throughout this period. And so constitutional interpretation was really shaped by and helped to shape the attitudes that people had towards slavery. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished chattel slavery in the United States, meaning that the Constitution since 1865 is, in effect, a different constitution on this issue from the original Constitution. So, to give you an idea of the intensity of the debate and the kinds of images that were being used and the central issue related to slavery, I want us to take a quick look at this image. You'll notice that we have a little banner here reading, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And we have a very physically imposing and powerful man who's been forced into this rather humiliating position, right? He's chained, he's forced to be a supplicant here, but he's crying out, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And so the central question here is whether people in the United States are going to recognize the shared humanity of those who have been enslaved and those who are considered free. And it's the denial of that shared humanity that's being protested in this image. So what does the Constitution have to say about this central moral issue of slavery? One short answer is, well, it doesn't really discuss slavery because the word doesn't appear in it. That answer is not really correct, though, because there are a couple of important lines that do mention slavery and that in effect acknowledge slavery and reinforce it, which was a reason why in the years leading up to the Civil War, some people who were opposed to slavery thought the Constitution was irremediably flawed. So the first example, Article 1, Section 2, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Well, those bound to service for a term of years are people who are perhaps indentured servants. However, the all other persons, the people who are counted as 3/5, are those who are enslaved. And so two things happen in this clause. One is that slavery is being recognized by this category, all other persons, persons who are not free. And there's also a rather insulting denial of their status within the Republic, right? That they're counted as 3/5. So that's the first clause. The full faith and credit clause, a very important clause of the Constitution in terms of the Union of States, also contains these very disturbing lines. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This is sometimes referred to as the fugitive slave clause. And what it means is that if someone escapes from slavery in one state into another, the state into which the person has escaped is required to return that person. So again, reinforces slavery and does so in a way that really eliminates the possibility of freedom for those who are enslaved. And finally, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, which effectively means that the transatlantic slave trade, while it can be prohibited after 1808, as indeed it was, cannot be prohibited before. And I just want to point out that you can find the entire transcript of the Constitution at www.archives.gov. So I've included that link in your PowerPoint if you want to look more closely at these clauses. So what do these clauses mean? For the supporters of slavery, the message was clear. They saw the Constitution as a document that supported the practice of slavery, if not as explicitly as they would have preferred. The Confederate Constitution at the time of the Civil War did away with any ambiguity. It just forthrightly endorsed slavery. For opponents of slavery, though, the meaning was subject to debate, with some opponents of slavery denouncing the Constitution itself, and some advocating a reading of the Constitution that pointed towards eventual emancipation. So, two anti-slavery views of the Constitution, represented by two figures who may be familiar to you. One of them almost certainly is, one of them may be less familiar. The person on the right, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. This is from campaign materials available at the Library of Congress, which is the happiest website in the whole world because in addition to being an actual physical library, its website contains a tremendous array of images. And it's great to kind of browse around and find images on it. We'll talk about Lincoln's view in a moment, but the more radical anti-slavery view is that of William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator and a major leader in the anti-slavery movement. He referred to the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and burned a copy of it in public. And the reason was precisely that he thought that the Constitution committed the nation to slavery. Lincoln's view was a little different. And so I want to run through this passage, which is actually a nice example of nonfiction as literature, from Lincoln's fragment on the Constitution and Union from January 1861. This is what Lincoln writes, and you can read along on your slide. All this is not the result of accident. It has a philosophical cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result, but even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. The expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain. But without it, we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better than a mere change of masters. The assertion of that principle, what is the principle? Well, the principle, he said above, is the principle of liberty to all, right? Liberty to all, including those who have been enslaved. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which is proved an apple of gold to us. And we'll remember that the principle in the first paragraph is liberty to all. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So let us act that neither picture nor apple shall ever be blurred or bruised or broken. So the apple of gold here is what's central. The frame is secondary. So the Constitution, the Union, they're vitally important. Lincoln was devoted to both the Constitution and the Union. He was a constitutional lawyer, first and foremost. But what he thought made the Constitution and Union valuable was the principle of liberty to all. And so ultimately for Lincoln, the Constitution had to be interpreted as the frame around the apple of gold, as the frame around the central principle of liberty to all. And therefore, ultimately, the Constitution had to move for Lincoln away from slavery and towards freedom. So here is Lincoln's Constitution. And he makes this very clear in his Gettysburg Address. In his Gettysburg Address, he says very famously, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. What is he referring back to here? Well, if you count back 77 years, 87 years, you get to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So for Lincoln, everything that he thinks about the Constitution has to be shaped by these guiding ideas. Liberty as the apple of gold, liberty as what the nation is conceived in, and the proposition that all men are created equal as the central guiding principle for constitutional interpretation. Now, this appears in broader anti-slavery literature as well. 19th century Americans who opposed slavery, including free and formerly enslaved African Americans, produced a rich body of literature attacking slavery. It included novels, short stories, poems, plays, speeches, essays, sermons, even legal arguments made before the Supreme Court. The writers of this literature held a broad range of views regarding the 1789 Constitution. And in some cases, those views changed over time, including in the cases of very famous figures like Frederick Douglass. And we see a picture of Frederick Douglass on the left here. We see a picture of James Monroe Whitfield, an important African-American poet who was born free and who worked as a barber, as a day job, and then wrote poetry whenever he had a chance. And they both give us a chance to reflect on how African-American writers who fought against slavery responded to the Constitution. Douglass started off as a Garrisonian. He was ready to reject the Constitution, but ultimately he came to a position that was closer to that of Lincoln, with the idea that if the central principle in the United States founding is liberty and equality via the Declaration of Independence, then it must be the case that slavery is a kind of contradiction to the founding. So this is what Douglass says in perhaps the greatest political speech made in the 19th century by an American. What to the slave is the 4th of July? Douglass says, "Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us?" So, your irony detectors, to use a term that we use a great deal in English class, should be pinging right now. And just in case you think that you're overreading, Douglass makes it clear that he means for you to detect the irony. In one of the most powerful moments in the speech, he says, "At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. And it is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced." If we're looking at this from the standpoint of literary analysis, we'll notice that this is a very well-constructed passage indeed. In the final sentence, for example, he's making use of parallelism, must be, must be, must be, and that contributes to the building sense of power in the phrases that Douglass is using as he makes his case that, in fact, by forgetting about principles of liberty and equality, and embracing slavery, the American Republic before the Civil War has in fact fallen short of the ideas of its foundings, has disgraced and betrayed the ideals of its founding. Well, I want to give an additional angle on how the Constitution is used in anti-slavery poetry. And here we turn to a US president who was in fact a bit of a poet himself, John Quincy Adams. Adams's poetry was not all that political. He wrote on topics like the sundial, and he wrote some comical poems actually as well. But he was the 6th president of the United States, and after his presidency, he was a constitutional lawyer who argued against the return to slavery of Cinque and the other Africans who rebelled on the Amistad. And you'll notice again that the image of him is from the Library of Congress. Go to the Library of Congress website. It has an amazing array of materials. Well, the person I mentioned earlier, James Monroe Whitfield, great early African-American poet, actually devoted a poem to John Quincy Adams and his constitutional arguments. Here's what he writes. "Eloquence did his heart inspire, and from his lips in glory blazed, till nations caught the glowing fire, and senates trembled as they praised. While all the recreant of the land to slavery's idol bowed the knee, a fawning, sycophantic band, fit tools of petty tyranny. He stood amid the recreant throng, the chosen champion of the free, and battled fearlessly and long for justice, right, and liberty. What though grim death has sealed his doom, who faithful proved to God and us, and slavery o'er the patriot's tomb, exalting, pours its deadliest curse. Among the virtuous and free, his memory will ever live, champion of right and liberty, the blessings truth and virtue give." Here again, John Quincy Adams has made an argument from the Constitution before the Supreme Court to free Cinque. James Monroe Whitfield is honoring him for his heroism, as he regards it, as a constitutional lawyer. This pattern continues with perhaps the most famous and certainly the best-selling novel of the 19th century in the United States, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. You can see Harriet Beecher Stowe in the picture here, once again from the Library of Congress. So she writes, and this is about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which grows out of that fugitive slave clause that we've already discussed. She writes this passage about a man who's a senator, and she makes the argument that ultimately, for him to be able to interpret the Constitution correctly, he needs to be able to grow morally. So she writes about him. He was as bold as a lion about it and mightily convinced not only himself, but everyone that heard him. But then his idea of a fugitive was only an idea of the letters that spell the word, or at most the image of a little newspaper picture of a man with a stick and bundle with ran away from subscriber under it. The magic of the real presence of distress, the imploring human eye, the frail, trembling human hand, the despairing appeal of helpless agony, these he had never tried. He had never thought that a fugitive might be a hapless mother, a defenseless child, like that one which was now wearing his lost boy's little well-known cap. And so, as our poor senator was not stone or steel, as he was a man, and a downright noble-hearted one too, he was, as everyone must see, in a sad case for his patriotism. And so it's precisely when he sees the human side of slavery, when he sees that actual children are being enslaved and are being separated from their mothers by slavery, and that a woman could run away because of the fact that her child might be taken from her, that he comes to revisit his understanding of the Constitution in a way that puts him more in line with Lincoln's idea that the principle of liberty has to be the apple of gold, has to be central. We come to another example from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is known in particular for Walden, for his experiment in living in the woods and sucking the marrow out of life. He also made some incredibly powerful anti-slavery speeches. Here he says, regarding the Constitution, what is one? It is men not of policy, but of probity, who recognize a higher law than the Constitution or the decision of the majority. The fate of the country does not depend on how you vote at the polls. The worst man is as strong as the best at that game. It does not depend on what kind of paper you drop into the ballot box once a year, but on what kind of man you drop from your chamber into the street each morning. So the question of the Constitution, centrally for Thoreau, has to do with the necessity of making moral decisions, making them in line with these principles of liberty and equality that are so central for Abraham Lincoln during the war. Ultimately, he's making the argument that the Constitution is going to have to serve these central principles, and that when it does, then it fulfills the aims that he sees necessary for good government, and that he believes the founders had or should have intended. So I mentioned earlier that the Constitution actually changes as a result of the Civil War. It's amended, the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, including the 13th, which ends slavery, the 14th, which includes the very important Equal Protection Clause. And so the result is that anti-slavery activists tend to see the Constitution differently after the Civil War, in part because it's a new Constitution in relation to slavery. And I want to share some lines as I close by perhaps the single most famous anti-slavery poet of the 19th century, the Quaker John Greenleaf Whittier. And here's what John Greenleaf Whittier writes in a poem about the 13th Amendment called Laus Deo, which means praise God. He writes, "How they pale, ancient myth and song and tale, in this wonder of our days, when the cruel rod of war blossoms white with righteous law, and the wrath of man is praise. Blotted out, all within and all about shall a fresher life begin, freer breathe the universe as it rolls its heavy curse on the dead and buried sin. It is done." And so for Whittier, what has happened now is that the text of the Constitution has come to match what Lincoln believed was the underlying spirit of the Constitution. Liberty and equality have become central in a way that they couldn't be before under the 1789 Constitution. And so now, in that sense, Lincoln's frame of silver has come more closely to resemble the apples of gold of those central ideas of liberty and equality. So that's what I wanted to share with you today about anti-slavery literature and the Constitution. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to any further conversations we might have.